When people think about medieval weapons, they usually picture the sword first. It's the weapon that dominates movies, games, and popular history. But on real battlefields in medieval Europe, the sword was often not the main weapon at all. The weapon that mattered far more, for far more soldiers, was simpler, cheaper, and much more practical. It shaped infantry tactics, cavalry combat, and the way armies actually fought. And despite that, it's still one of the most misunderstood weapons of the Middle Ages. To understand medieval warfare properly, you have to look past the sword and focus on the spear. Number 1. The forgotten weapon. Ask people to picture a medieval battlefield, and most of them see swords first. They imagine bright blades, duels between knights, and that clean movie image where the sword is the one weapon that really matters. The strange part is that once you step away from legend and look at how armies actually fought in medieval Europe, the picture changes fast. The weapon that keeps showing up, from early medieval graves to battle art to militia equipment, is not the sword, it is the spear. Sometimes it is a simple thrusting spear. Sometimes it becomes a cavalry lance. Later it stretches into the pike or changes into other staff weapons built for a tougher battlefield. But the core idea stays the same. A point on a long shaft gave ordinary soldiers, trained fighters, mounted elites, and town militias a weapon that solved the basic problem of war better than almost anything else. It let you hit first, keep danger farther away, stand in line with other men, and fight without needing the kind of metalwork a fine sword demanded. That does not mean swords were useless, or rare, or unimportant. Medieval people clearly valued them. In some places, they were treasured family weapons, status symbols, and in the hands of mounted men-at-arms, they were serious battlefield tools. But prestige and practical dominance are not the same thing.
Early Anglo-Saxon grave evidence makes that difference very clear. Spearheads are the commonest weapons found in men's burials, while swords stand out as the prestigious option, the one linked with high status and skilled craftsmanship. That same split keeps appearing in different forms across the medieval centuries. The sword sits high in the imagination. The spear sits lower in the social ladder, but closer to the daily reality of war. And once you notice that, a lot of things that look confusing in medieval warfare suddenly make sense. Why did foot soldiers so often fight in dense formations? Why did cavalry charges revolve around long shafts instead of slashing blades? Why did later medieval armies invest so much in pikes, bills, halberds, and poleaxes? Why do so many pictures of famous battles show forests of spear shafts rather than heroic sword fights? The answer is not that medieval people failed to appreciate swords. The answer is that the battlefield rewarded reach, mass, and formation. And the spear family delivered all three. So if the goal is to understand what actually shaped combat in medieval Europe, the real starting point is not the sword hanging at a belt. It is the long weapon already in the hand. Number 2. Why swords took credit. The sword still took center stage in memory for good reasons, and that is where a lot of the confusion begins. A sword was more than a tool. It carried social meaning. In many parts of medieval Europe, carrying a sword in public was tied to status, regulation, and the warrior class. Noblemen were more likely to wear one openly, while peasants and townsmen were often restricted, especially in peacetime inside city walls. That gave the sword a kind of public visibility that a spear did not have. A spear was what you brought to war, a levy, a watch, a muster, or a campaign. A sword was also something people saw on the body of a noble, in ritual, in art, and in stories. It was part of how power looked.
In some places, authorities even regulated what blades could be carried inside towns, and shorter sidearms were treated differently from full swords. That kind of rule did not just control violence, it reinforced the sword's social image. A spear was too large and too obviously military to function as an everyday sign of rank. A sword, hanging visibly from the body, could become part of dress, law, and ritual all at once. That matters because memory follows symbols as much as facts. The sword also benefited from the way medieval elites were written about. Chronicles, romances, and later legends cared a lot about knights, noble families, and personal honor. Those are exactly the worlds where named swords, decorated hilts, and inherited blades mattered most. A fine sword could be passed down, mounted in a rich scabbard, blessed, gifted, ransomed, and remembered. The spear almost never got that treatment, even when it did more of the actual work on the field. Grave finds and museum collections keep repeating the same pattern. Swords show expensive workmanship, elite ownership, and careful symbolism. Spears show practicality, wide use, and sheer presence. Even the shape of a sword helped its image. Medieval Christians could read the crossguard and blade together as a cross-like form, and that gave the weapon spiritual and cultural weight beyond combat. Then, later centuries made the gap even wider. Renaissance art, 19th century Romantic painting, historical novels, and modern film all loved the sword because it is easy to recognize and easy to turn into a hero's weapon. One blade, one fighter, one dramatic moment. A spear does not sell personal myth in the same way. It works best with distance, discipline, and numbers. It belongs to a line, a charge, a wall, a formation. That makes it less glamorous on screen, but not less important in reality.
So the sword stole the story partly because it was visually striking, partly because elites carried it, and partly because later culture kept repeating that image until it felt natural. Once that happens, people start reading the whole Middle Ages backwards. They see a sword and assume it was the main weapon everywhere. They see a spear and assume it was crude, cheap, or second-rate. In practice, the sword often represented status and identity, while the spear represented battlefield logic. Medieval armies needed both, but not in the same way. Number 3. What a spear was. One reason the spear gets misunderstood is that people hear the word and imagine a single, simple object, almost primitive, like one idea that never changed. Medieval Europeans did not use the spear that way. The spear was really a whole family of weapons built on the same principle. Put a sharp metal head on a wooden shaft and use reach to control space. The size, balance, and purpose could change a lot. Some were short enough to throw. Some were meant mainly for thrusting behind a shield. Some were built for cavalry and became lances. Some grew longer and longer until they turned into pikes. Others stayed in that middle zone where a man on foot could still move quickly, brace, jab, and recover. The metal head might be broad and leaf-shaped, narrow and stiff, or reinforced for better penetration. The shaft mattered just as much as the blade. Ash and other woods were valued because they could take shock and flex without instantly failing. And the construction itself made sense for mass warfare. A spearhead used much less metal than a sword blade. The shaft could be made separately, repaired, or replaced. If the head survived, the weapon could live on with a new haft. That basic design was adaptable in a way that many modern depictions never show. Early medieval spears could be used with shields in close lines. At Hastings in 1066, the Bayeux Tapestry, and later interpretation of it, show both sides using spears, with some Saxons carrying bundles for throwing, and Norman horsemen using lance-like spears from horseback. By the High and Late Middle Ages, the same core concept kept evolving, rather than disappearing. Cavalry refined the lance. Infantry stretched the idea into the pike. English foot soldiers favored bills. Swiss formations made halberds and pikes famous. Aristocrats in armor used poleaxes in judicial combats and serious fighting. All of these weapons are related in a practical sense. They are answers to the same problem. How do you keep reach, striking power, and control against armored men, horses, or a packed line of enemies? That is why treating the spear as some low-level weapon that belonged only to poor soldiers misses the point. Yes, simple spears were common among poorer men, but the same principle also shaped elite cavalry shock combat and the most disciplined infantry systems of the later Middle Ages. The spear was not the opposite of military development. It was one of the clearest signs of it. As armor improved and formations changed, the spear family did not vanish. It specialized, multiplied, and adapted right along with the battlefield. Number 4. Reach changed everything. Once you stop looking at weapons as symbols and start looking at them as problems of distance, the spear's advantage becomes obvious. Reach is not just about having a longer weapon. It changes timing. A fighter with more reach can threaten first, force reactions first, and make the other man cross a dangerous gap before he can do anything. That matters in a duel, but it matters far more in formation fighting, where the man in front is not alone. If one line of infantry is standing shoulder to shoulder with spears and shields, the enemy does not face one point. He faces a row of them.
By the time he gets close enough to use a shorter weapon, he has already spent the hardest part of the fight just trying to enter that zone alive and in balance. The same logic applies to cavalry. A mounted warrior already has height, speed, and the mass of the horse. Put a long lance in his hand, and that reach becomes even more decisive. The point arrives before the sword can. Even when the blow did not kill outright, it could unhorse, wound, break formation, or create the instant of panic that bigger formations live on. Later medieval pike systems pushed the same idea to an extreme. A wall of long shafts meant horses did not want to charge straight in, and armored men on foot had to fight through several rows of threatening points before they could reach the bodies behind them. Medieval writers and later analysts kept noticing this because it was so central. Sound infantry armed with pikes could stop cavalry, sometimes even when outnumbered, as long as they stayed cohesive. That word, cohesive, is the key. The spear is not misunderstood only because people underrate it. It is misunderstood because people keep treating medieval combat as if it were mainly personal swordsmanship. A spear does not just reward individual skill. It rewards order. It lets less glamorous qualities decide the fight: spacing, nerve, timing, formation discipline, and the willingness to stand with your line. That is exactly why the weapon appears over and over again among militias, town levies, household troops, and professional soldiers. It scales. Give 10 men swords, and you have 10 separate fighters. Give 10 men spears, and train them to stand properly, and suddenly you have a front. Give 100 men pikes, and you have a moving obstacle that even cavalry has to respect. That is one of the biggest reasons the spear belongs closer to the center of medieval warfare than the sword ever can. It shaped how groups fought, not just how individuals struck. Number 5. The common soldier. That group advantage mattered because most medieval wars were not fought by lone armored heroes. They were fought by mixtures of knights, men-at-arms, archers, crossbowmen, mercenaries, town militias, retainers, and foot soldiers, carrying whatever suited their role and resources. The Metropolitan Museum points out that medieval burghers of a certain age and wealth were often expected by law to keep their own arms and armor, and that usually meant not a full knightly outfit, but a helmet, some body defense, and a weapon such as a spear, pike, bow, or crossbow. That is a very different picture from the fantasy version of the Middle Ages, where everybody important has a sword. For a city, a lord, or a king trying to arm a lot of men, the spear made hard sense. You needed less high-quality metal than a sword demanded. The weapon was fast to understand at a basic level. You could use it in watch duty, on campaign, in a street, at a gate, or in a field formation. If the shaft broke, you replaced the shaft. If the head was sound, it still had value. English Heritage's summary of Hastings goes even further for the 11th century and calls the iron-headed spear the poorer warrior's weapon, while still showing that both sides used it. That is the point. The spear could belong to a poorer fighter and still be a decisive battlefield arm. Medieval armies were full of these practical choices. In the 100 Years' War, the Royal Armouries notes that battles were largely fought on foot, and that men fighting on foot had a variety of staff weapons, often growing out of simple hunting or agricultural tools, such as axes and spears. That line matters because it shows something bigger than one weapon. Medieval warfare was deeply physical and deeply practical. Weapons that could be produced in numbers, used in formation, and adapted from familiar tools had huge staying power. The common soldier did not need a romantic weapon.
He needed something that helped him survive the first contact. A spear behind a shield did that. A pike in a block did that. A bill with a hook that could drag a rider down did that. And even when a foot soldier did carry a sword, sources regularly place it at his side rather than in his hands at the start of the action. That is because the sword was often what you reached for after the formation broke, after the lines crashed together, or when the fight got too close for a longer haft. So the common soldier's relationship to the spear was not about being under-equipped. It was about being equipped for the kind of war he was actually going to face. Number 6. The knight's main reach. Now the argument gets even more interesting because the spear was not just the weapon of ordinary foot soldiers. It also sat at the center of knightly battlefield combat, in the form of the lance. Medieval people absolutely associated knights with swords, and not without reason. The sword was tied to status, ceremony, and identity. But on the battlefield, when mounted combat opened at speed, the knight's principal offensive weapon was very often the lance. St. Anselm's late 11th century list of knightly equipment includes both lance and sword, and tactical writing on medieval cavalry keeps stressing the same order. The mounted man opened with the lance, and then continued with the sword if the fight closed. At Hastings, Norman horsemen are more often shown wielding long spears or lances than slashing swords, and those weapons could be used overarm, underhand, or even thrown. Around 1100, the technique of couching the lance under the arm spread in Western Europe. That change sounds technical, but it was huge. It let horse, rider, saddle, stirrup, and weapon act together as one striking system. Over time, better saddles, stronger horses, and improved armor made this kind of shock combat more effective. This also depended on equipment beyond the weapon itself. Better saddles, stirrups, bits, and stronger war horses turned horse and rider into a more stable striking platform. By the 12th century, a mounted man with a couched lance was not just holding a long spear. He was using a full system that let the charge deliver far more of the horse's momentum through the point. That is why the lance cannot be treated as some side note in knightly warfare. It was central to how cavalry translated wealth, breeding, armor, and training into battlefield effect. In other words, even the classic image of the medieval knight depends heavily on a spear-like weapon, not just a sword. The sword was there, but often as the follow-up. That is easy to miss because later culture merges all knightly fighting into generic sword combat. Real mounted warfare was more layered than that. The first impact was about reach and force. The next phase, if the rider stayed mounted or had to keep fighting after the lance was lost or broken, brought in the sword. And if the rider dismounted or became locked in close combat, then daggers, grappling, and other weapons might matter too. So the spear does not sit outside the knightly world. It sits inside it, right at the moment when cavalry had its greatest battlefield advantage. Even the famous joust is basically a stylized form of this logic. Two riders do not begin by dueling with swords. They test each other with lances, because the lance is the weapon that best converts speed and distance into a decisive hit. That should change the whole way we picture knightly warfare. The sword remained a badge of class and a very real weapon, but the lance was often the tool that made mounted aristocratic warfare function in the first place. Number 7. Early medieval reality. The early Middle Ages make this even clearer, because the evidence is harder to romanticize.
In Anglo-Saxon England, grave goods show spears buried with men far more commonly than swords, while swords stand out as prestigious pieces linked to higher status and skilled manufacture. That already tells you something basic. The culture valued the sword, but everyday warrior equipment leaned heavily toward the spear. The same general truth appears in art and narrative. The Bayeux tapestry is full of spear use. It shows foot soldiers, mounted men, thrown weapons, and long shafts everywhere. English Heritage's reading of the tapestry notes that some Saxons appear holding bundles of spears ready to throw, while Norman knights use lances to thrust through or at the edges of the shield wall. That matters because Hastings is one of the most famous battles of the entire medieval period. And even there, the battlefield is not dominated by neat sword fights. It is crowded with shields, spears, horses, axes, and missiles. The shield wall itself also tells the same story. A shield wall is not just men standing with boards. It works best when the men behind those shields can project threat forward without breaking the line. Spears do that far better than swords. A short weapon forces the fighter to open himself more, step farther out, and lose formation integrity. A thrusting spear lets a man stay connected to the line. That is one reason the early medieval battlefield so often looks like a contest of pressure, nerve, and formation, rather than a stage for personal duels. Even elite weapons fit the same pattern. The Danish axe, famous among Harold's housecarls, was terrifying, but it was also specialized, demanding space and commitment. The spear was easier to integrate across a wider body of troops. It could be used by poorer warriors, by household troops, by mounted men, and in some cases as a throwing weapon before the lines met.
So when people speak about the early medieval Dark Ages as if warfare was crude, they usually miss how practical and effective these weapon choices were. The armies were not primitive because they used spears. They used spears because the weapon matched the conditions of combat remarkably well. It offered reach in dense formations, flexibility in open fighting, and enough simplicity to equip lots of men. That is why the early Middle Ages are not an exception to the spear story. They are one of the clearest proofs of it. Number 8. Infantry fights back. As the Middle Ages moved on, the spear did not fade under the pressure of heavily armored cavalry.
In many ways, it became even more central because infantry learned to build entire systems around long staff weapons. The classic examples come from the late 13th and early 14th centuries. At Falkirk in 1298, Scottish schiltrons used tightly packed long spears or pikes pointed outward toward the enemy. At Courtrai in 1302, Flemish infantry on difficult ground defeated French chivalry. At Bannockburn in 1314, Scottish formations again showed what disciplined, long-weapon infantry could do against a more traditionally knight-heavy force. In Switzerland, battles like Morgarten in 1315 and later Sempach made the military world take halberds and pikes very seriously. The details of each battle differ, and terrain always matters, but the pattern is hard to miss. Infantry that held formation and used reach well could neutralize cavalry's advantages. That did not mean knights suddenly became useless. It meant the battlefield no longer belonged to them in the old, nearly automatic way. A horse does not want to throw itself onto a hedge of points. Another thing often missed is that even the age of the famous knight was not simply an age of mounted sword fighting. In the 100 Years' War, many major battles were largely fought on foot.
Men-at-arms could and did fight dismounted, and when they did, they used staff weapons as well as swords. That tells you how deep the long weapon logic ran. The battlefield kept rewarding any tool that could manage contact before it turned into a close crush, whether that tool was a spear, pike, bill, halberd, or lance, used by a man who had just come off his horse. An armored rider who loses momentum, or gets pushed into broken ground, or meets a dense formation that keeps its nerve, is suddenly fighting the wrong battle. By the 14th and 15th centuries, that lesson shaped military thinking across Europe. The pike's great age began. Staff weapons multiplied. Urban militias and mercenaries became more important. English bills became a serious infantry tool. Swiss pike and halberd formations earned a reputation that other states wanted to copy or hire. None of this works if you treat the medieval battlefield as a place where the sword was always the star. The real story is that the long weapon kept answering new tactical problems. The spear itself stretched into pikes. The same logic produced bills and halberds. Even when armies mixed missiles, guns, and men-at-arms, long-shafted weapons kept returning because they shaped contact better than swords did. And once infantry formations got good enough at this, the balance of prestige and practical value moved even farther apart. The mounted noble might still carry the most elegant blade, but a formation of trained foot soldiers with long weapons could decide whether that noble ever got the kind of fight he wanted. Number 9. Armor changed the fight. Armor is where a lot of modern arguments go off track. People often assume that as armor improved, swords became pointless and everyone had to switch to crushing weapons. That is too simple. The real change was more technical and more interesting. Early mail protected well against many cuts, and later plate armor, completed as full harness by the early 15th century, made the battlefield even tougher. But armor did not make weapons irrelevant. It changed what counted as an effective hit. Swords adapted by becoming more capable thrusting weapons, with stiffer, more acute points that could seek the gaps in plate armor. Daggers did the same at very close range. Fighters also changed technique, gripping swords in ways that gave better control for thrusting into openings. At the same time, long staff weapons evolved to answer the armored battlefield even more directly. The poleaxe combined an axe blade, a hammer face, and a thrusting spike on a long haft. The halberd let infantry cut, thrust, hook, and unhorse. The pike relied less on smashing armor than on controlling distance and massed pressure.
What matters here is that the spear family did not lose relevance when armor improved. In some roles, it became more useful. A long weapon could keep an armored man away, threaten the horse, probe at openings, or work as part of a formation that denied room to maneuver. Even the sword's continued importance often proves the rule rather than breaks it. Royal Armory's descriptions of late medieval swords stress thrusting into gaps, and even then they repeatedly identify swords as sidearms for many foot soldiers. That means the long weapon still handled the first layer of the fight. The sword took over when distance collapsed. Another popular myth also needs clearing away here. Plate armor did not turn fighters into clumsy metal statues. The Metropolitan Museum points out that properly fitted armor allowed wide movement, and that the old image of men being hauled onto horses by cranes is nonsense. That matters because it explains why long weapons remained so useful. Medieval armored combat was mobile, technical, and violent in a controlled way. Reach, leverage, and precision mattered more, not less.
A man in good armor could still attack, retreat, grapple, mount, and fight on foot. That made weapon choice a question of tactical role, not just raw hitting power. So, armor did not push Europe toward a simple blunt beats sharp rule. It pushed warfare toward more specialized systems, and the spear family was one of the biggest winners of that change. Number 10. The pike wall. If the ordinary spear explains the logic of medieval combat, the pike shows that logic at full scale. By the later Middle Ages, the pike had become an extremely long infantry weapon, often between 16 and 22 feet in length. That is far beyond what most people picture when they hear the word spear, but the core idea is identical. Reach first, control distance, and make the enemy come through points before he can reach bodies. The Royal Armories describes the pike's great age as beginning in the 14th century, and Britannica makes the same broader point when it notes that sound infantry armed with pikes could fend off cavalry with ease, even when outnumbered, provided their cohesion held. That last condition is everything. A pike is not a dueling weapon. It is a formation weapon. One pike is awkward. 4 or 5 ranks of pikes pointed forward create a tactical fact that even armored men-at-arms have to respect. The pike also exposes something people often miss about medieval armies. Long weapons did not replace shorter ones so much as organize them. Pikemen usually carried sidearms because a pike was unwieldy once the formation collapsed or the fight turned at close range. So again, the sword appears, but as the backup to a long-reach system. That is a very different relationship from the one most pop culture teaches. The sword was there because the pike could not do everything. The pike was there because the sword could not control first contact. Swiss soldiers turned this into an art through training and aggressive use. Flemish and Scottish infantry showed earlier that long weapon formations could break elite cavalry myths. Other rulers noticed. Mercenaries carrying pikes became attractive precisely because they gave states a way to field disciplined foot against mounted power. And the pike did not need an enormous fancy blade to matter. Its head could be relatively small. The weapon's real power came from length, numbers, and discipline. That is one of the clearest signs that medieval warfare was not obsessed with beautiful individual weapons, nearly as much as later imagination is. The deadliest thing on a field could be simple in appearance, but devastating in system. A pike block looked less dramatic than a sword duel. It mattered more. And once you accept that, the spear stops looking like the sword's crude ancestor and starts looking like the design principle that kept winning new arguments on the battlefield. Number 11. Beyond simple spears. The next step is important, because the spear's story does not end with the pike. Medieval Europe kept building new staff weapons that borrowed the spear's biggest strengths and added specialized functions. The bill is a good example. Popular in England from the mid-13th century onward, it grew from the bill hook, an agricultural cutting tool. On the battlefield, it became a long-hafted infantry weapon with a cutting blade, a forward hook, and a top spike. That meant it could cut, thrust, hook reins, and drag mounted men off balance. The halberd took another route. First associated especially with the Swiss, it combined an axe-like blade, a rear fluke or hook, and a top spike. That gave it the ability to slash, thrust, and pull. The poleaxe, used especially by armored elites, pushed specialization even further, with axe, hammer, and spike functions on one staff. Look at these weapons together, and the pattern is obvious. Medieval Europe did not move away from the spear concept. It kept re-engineering it.
As battlefields became more crowded with armor, horses, and disciplined infantry, designers wanted more than a simple point. They wanted the point plus something else. A hook to unhorse, a hammer to dent armor, a blade to chop when openings appeared. But the long haft stayed. Reach stayed. Leverage stayed. Control of distance stayed. Even the social spread of these weapons is telling. Bills were associated with infantry. Halberds became famous with Swiss foot. Poleaxes were used by aristocrats and officers in both war and formal combat. That means the staff weapon solution worked across class lines, from the town militiaman to the armored noble. The sword did not disappear in this world, but it no longer looks like the obvious main event. In fact, some of the best late medieval evidence points the other way. At Agincourt in 1415, Royal Armories notes that the French were packed so tightly they could barely use their swords. Space had become precious. In that kind of crush, long weapons, daggers, grappling, and sheer formation pressure mattered more than elegant blade work. So when people reduce medieval weapons to swords, axes, and maces, they miss the most revealing trend of all. Europe kept investing in longer hafted weapons because those weapons solved more battlefield problems. The spear was not left behind. It kept growing branches. Number 12. The sword at the hip. At this point, it becomes easier to put the sword back in its real place without unfairly downplaying it. The sword mattered. It was effective, sophisticated, and often beautifully made. It was not absurdly heavy, and good medieval swords were balanced weapons, not clumsy clubs. For knights and mounted men-at-arms, the sword remained a major weapon and an essential part of identity. In late medieval combat, pointed blades and refined fencing techniques made swords better at thrusting into armor gaps. Two-handed and hand-and-a-half swords could deliver serious force.
Some professional foot soldiers also carried swords. None of that is fake. The distortion appears when people turn those truths into the whole story. Many sources quietly place the sword in a secondary or follow-on role. Royal Armories repeatedly calls shorter swords sidearms for common foot soldiers. Pikemen carried swords because pikes were too long once lines broke. Knights opened mounted combat with lances and continued with swords. Daggers served as last resort tools in close grappling. That is not the profile of a weapon that dominates every phase of war. It is the profile of a weapon that remains extremely useful because no single battlefield tool does everything. The sword had advantages the spear did not. It was easier to wear all day. It was handy once combat got very close. It worked in tighter spaces. It could cut and thrust, and a trained fighter could use it with great speed and flexibility. It was also a perfect badge of rank because it was portable, personal, and visually striking. You could not stroll through a city or a court with a pike on your shoulder and expect it to signal noble identity in the same way. A sword on the belt did that immediately. So the sword became the weapon people remembered and displayed, while long weapons remained the tools that structured contact. That is why, even when medieval armies became more professional and more technically advanced, the sword survived rather than replaced everything else. It did a different job. It was the personal weapon that came into its own after range closed, after the lance broke, after the pike line bent, after the shield wall collapsed, or when a man needed something at his side instead of in both hands. In modern terms, that makes the sword less like the default battlefield answer and more like the essential secondary system. That does not make it lesser. It makes medieval warfare make sense. Number 13. What manuals show.
Another reason the spear is misunderstood is that people think medieval weapon use was rough, instinctive, and mostly untrained. The surviving fight books say otherwise. Europe's martial manuals show systems, not chaos. It is also worth noticing what these books do not suggest. They do not present the sword as the answer to every situation. Even when a manuscript spends many pages on swords, that reflects the weapon's popularity and prestige, not the idea that other arms were secondary in every context. Once armor, horseback fighting, or formal combats enter the picture, the manuals widen quickly. Spears, lances, poleaxes, daggers, and wrestling all appear because real combat demanded choices, not worship of one blade. The famous Royal Armouries manuscript 1.33 from around the early 14th century focuses on sword and buckler, which already tells you medieval fighters were thinking carefully about guards, positions, and timing. Later manuals go wider. Hans Talhofer's 15th century fight book includes material on combat with and without armor, and weapons ranging from long swords and daggers to maces, thrusting shields, and spears. The point is not that every battlefield soldier studied a manuscript. Most did not. The point is that elite and professional fighting culture understood weapons as technical systems with different jobs. A spear was not just pointed forward. Its use changed with foot or horse, with shield or without shield, in open field or in formal combat, in armored or unarmored encounters. Manuals and illustrations also help correct another bad assumption, that once armor appears, all subtlety disappears, and fighting becomes mindless smashing. In fact, armored combat texts and object studies keep showing the opposite. Fighters used angles, leverage, grips, thrusts to openings, and weapon-specific choices based on range. A poleaxe was not chosen because people forgot how to use swords. It was chosen because in some armored contexts, it offered the right mix of reach, penetration, leverage, and control. The same logic applies to spears and lances. Once you see medieval combat through that lens, the spear looks less like the crude ancestor of better weapons and more like a highly flexible solution inside a technical martial culture. That matters for interpreting art, too. When manuscripts, tomb sculpture, or tapestries show long weapons, it is easy to dismiss them as generic. They are not generic. They are often the clearest clue to how the fight was expected to work. A knight with a lance, an infantryman with a bill, a block of pikes, or a duel with poleaxes all point toward a world where distance and weapon role were thought about very carefully. The sword still held prestige in that world, but the manuals reveal something later storytelling hides. Medieval fighters did not worship one perfect weapon. They matched weapons to tasks, and the spear family kept receiving important tasks century after century. Number 14. What pop culture misses.
That brings us straight to the modern misunderstanding. Films, games, and even many documentaries tend to compress the medieval battlefield into images that are easier to recognize fast. The knight rides in with a sword. The infantryman swings an axe. Armor makes everyone slow. Long weapons are background decoration until a hero drops them and gets to the real fight with a blade. Almost every part of that picture is distorted. Knights certainly used swords, but mounted combat was built around lances. Armor could be heavy, but fitted armor still allowed serious movement. Infantry did not just wave random farm tools around. By the late Middle Ages, many staff weapons were specialized military designs. And long weapons were not there because people had not invented something better. They were there because reach, leverage, and formation kept winning arguments that shorter weapons could not win.
Another problem is the obsession with single combat. Medieval battles did contain personal duels, charges, and moments of individual heroism. But armies were systems. Foot and horse had to cooperate. Missile troops shaped the field before hand-to-hand contact. Terrain changed everything. Formations could hold or collapse. A spear or pike makes perfect sense in that world because it connects the individual soldier to the system around him. A sword looks better on a poster because it isolates the fighter. That is why modern audiences instinctively overvalue it. They are seeing the battlefield through the needs of storytelling, not through the needs of surviving first contact. Even where pop culture stumbles into something real, it often stops too early. Yes, late medieval swords could be excellent weapons against armor when used for thrusting. Yes, elite warriors owned beautiful blades. Yes, swordsmanship mattered. But none of that means the sword was the weapon that best represented how medieval European warfare worked as a whole. If you want the weapon that ties together levy troops, militia laws, shield walls, cavalry shock, pike blocks, anti-horse infantry tactics, and the later explosion of staff weapons, the spear is a much better answer. It is not as pretty in memory, it is more revealing in practice. And that is why calling it the most misunderstood medieval weapon is not just a clever title. It gets at the gap between how the Middle Ages are sold and how they actually fought. Number 15. The battlefield picture. So when the battlefield comes back into focus, it stops looking like a gallery of sword heroes and starts looking like layered distance. First come the missiles, arrows or bolts shaping movement. Then the long weapons define the approach. Shields lock, spears project forward, lances lower. Horses hesitate at dense points. Pike blocks push space outward. Bills and halberds wait for the moment when a rider comes too close or a formation opens.
Only after those layers begin to break down do shorter weapons become the center of action. That is when swords, falchions, daggers, wrestling, and pure brutality take over at arm's length. Medieval Europe kept returning to this pattern because it worked. In the early Middle Ages, spear and shield fit the logic of the shield wall. In knightly warfare, the lance gave mounted elites their first and often most decisive strike. In the infantry revival of the later Middle Ages, pikes and other staff weapons let disciplined foot soldiers challenge or stop cavalry. In crowded fights like Agincourt, space became so tight that even good swords were hard to use properly. Across all of these changes, the sword never disappears, but it also never erases the deeper pattern. The deeper pattern is that medieval war rewarded the weapon that could control approach, maintain formation, and keep danger one step farther away. That is why so many of the famous turning points of medieval warfare involve long weapons in some form. It is why burghers were expected to keep spears or pikes. It is why grave evidence can show spears as common and swords as prestigious at the same time. It is why the most iconic knight in armor still began the fight with a lance. And it is why, by the late Middle Ages, Europe had not moved past the spear so much as stretched it into every shape the battlefield demanded. If you picture a real medieval army now, the scene changes. You still see swords, and you should. You see them on belts, in close combat, in finishing blows, in the hands of nobles and professionals. But you also see something that matters more to the shape of the fight: shafts everywhere. Ordinary spears behind shields, long lances under mounted arms, pike points stacked in ranks, bills and halberds waiting to hook, cut, or thrust. Not one heroic blade dominating the whole era, but a whole military world organized around reach.
That is much closer to how medieval Europe actually fought, and it is why the weapon most people treat like a backup was so often the weapon doing the real battlefield work.